Okay, this is the introduction from The Way to Rainy Mountain by N. Scott Momaday. He is a Native American author, and like it says here in the background information on this essay, he is descended from the Kiowa Nation, and so a lot of his work draws from that heritage of his. So as we're reading this, keep thinking again about the essential question for this unit, this idea of literature and place and how those things are related, and how does that reflected in his work as compared to some of the other works that we have read. The single knoll rises out of the plain in Oklahoma, north and west of the Wichita Range. For my people, the Kiowas, it is an old landmark, and they gave it the name Rainy Mountain. The hardest weather in the world is there. Winter brings blizzards, hot tornadic winds arise in the spring, and in summer the prairie is an anvil's edge. An anvil, think about anvil, really, you like hammer metal out on, so it is hard and sharp, I guess. It's something that you could break things on. Obviously not literally. The grass turns brittle and brown and cracks beneath your feet, and there are green belts along the rivers and creeks, linear groves of hickory and pecan, willow and witch hazel. At a distance, in July or August, the steaming foliage seems almost to writhe in fire. Great green and yellow grasshoppers are everywhere in the tall grass, popping up like corn to sting the flesh, and tortoises crawl about on the red earth, going nowhere in the plenty of time. Loneliness is an aspect of the land. I like this description here. That's an interesting. How do you describe the land? Loneliness is an aspect of it. I'm going to highlight that. And I'm also going to try and zoom in so we can see this a little better. There it is. There we go. Okay. All things in the plain are isolate. There is no confusion of objects in the eye, but one hill or one tree or one man. To look upon the landscape in the early morning, the sun at your back, is to lose the sense of proportion. Your imagination comes to life, and this, you think, is where creation was begun. So we've talked, back before spring break, one of the things that we talked about was sensory language, right? And there's a lot of it in this paragraph. He is, describing in great detail, not just what it looks like, but also what it sounds like as he's talking about the grasshoppers. And you can kind of picture some of the sounds that would come with this. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this. Just a little quick text comment. Maybe they're going to let me do it. So lots of sensory language. We've got description of what the setting looks like. I returned to Rainy Mountain in July. My grandmother had died in the spring, and I wanted to be at her grave. She had lived to be very old, and at last infirm, meaning sick, or ill. Her only living daughter was with her when she died, and I was told that in death her face was that of a child. I like to think of her as a child. When she was born, the Kiowas were living that last great moment of their history. For more than 100 years, they had controlled the open range from the Smoky Hill River to the Red, from the headwaters of the Canadian to the forks of the Arkansas and the Cimarron, in alliance with the Comanches. They had ruled the whole of the southern plains. War was their sacred business, and they were among the finest horsemen the world has ever known. But warfare for the Kiowas was preeminently a matter of disposition rather than of survival, and they never understood the grim, unrelenting advance of the U.S. cavalry. So this is talking about the interaction then between, his ancestors and the U.S. as there was expansion of, white Americans moving west. When at last, divided and ill-provisioned, they were driven onto the staked plains in the cold rains of autumn, they fell into panic. In Palo Duro Canyon, they abandoned their crucial stores to pillage and had nothing then but their lives. In order to save themselves, they surrendered to the soldiers at Fort Sill and were imprisoned in the old stone corral that now stands as a military museum. My grandmother was spared the humiliation of those high gray walls by 8 or 10 years, but she must have known from birth the affliction of defeat, the dark brooding of old warriors. So this is a sort of a context, right, for his, not too distant ancestors, if it's really just his grandma's generation that experienced this. Her name was Aho, and she belonged to the last culture to evolve in North America. Her forebears came down from the high country in western Montana nearly 3 centuries ago. They were a mountain people, a mysterious tribe of hunters whose language has never been positively classified in any major group. In the late 17th century, they began a long migration to the south and east. It was a journey toward the dawn, and it led to a golden age. Along the way, the Kiowas were befriended by the Crows, who gave them the culture and religion of the plains. They acquired horses, and their ancient nomadic spirit was suddenly free of the ground. They acquired Taime, the sacred Sundance doll, from that moment the object and symbol of their worship, and so shared in the divinity of the sun. Not least, they acquired the sense of destiny, therefore courage and pride. Then they entered upon the southern plains. When they entered upon the southern plains, they had been transformed. No longer were they slaves to the simple necessity of survival. They were a lordly and dangerous society of fighters and thieves, hunters and priests of the sun. According to the origin myth, they entered the world through a hollow log. From one point of view, their migration was the fruit of an old prophecy, for indeed they emerged from a sunless world. Although my grandmother lived out her long life in the shadow of Rainy Mountain, the immense landscape of the continental interior lay like memory in her blood. She could tell of the Crows, whom she had never seen, and of the Black Hills, where she had never been. So if we're thinking back to our essential question for this unit and this idea of place influencing, if you think back to that first essay we read, the literature of place, how place influences your imagination, or place influences kind of how you view the world, then this is quite a thing, right? The continental interior lay like memory in her blood. So like even these places that she's never seen, somehow innately she just knows about these places. So his grandmother knew about places that she had never seen. Let's say connection to place was in her blood. I wanted to see in reality what she had seen more perfectly in the mind's eye, and traveled the 1,500 miles to begin my pilgrimage. So again, another interesting contrast, the way he says that, right? That she'd seen it more perfectly in her mind than he could see it in reality. Somehow her ability to be connected with it on this sort of deeper level was greater than he was ever going to achieve just by going there physically, which is an interesting idea. So I'm going to make a little comment about that. Seems worth commenting on. So he thinks that her understanding of place was greater than his ever will be, even though he will be able to go there physically. Okay. Yellowstone, it seemed to me, was the top of the world, a region of deep lakes and dark timber, canyons and waterfalls. But beautiful as it is, one might have the sense of confinement there. So if you've ever been to Yellowstone, the idea that you might feel confinement at Yellowstone is interesting because, it's just this huge open place of nature. So keep reading and see what he means by that. The skyline in all directions is close at hand, the high wall of the woods and the deep cleavages of shade. There is a perfect freedom in the mountains, but it belongs to the eagle and the elk, the badger and the bear. The Kiowas reckoned their stature by the distance they could see, and they were bent and blind in the wilderness. So basically, if they are used to it, like open grasslands and plains, then that is not Yellowstone, right? Mountains obstructed and so forth. So I guess that's what he means by the sense of confinement. Descending eastward, the highland meadows are a stairway to the plain. In July, the inland slope of the Rockies is luxuriant with flax and buckwheat, stonecrop and larkspur. The earth unfolds and the limit of the land recedes. Clusters of trees and animals growing far in the distance cause the vision to reach away and wonder to build upon the mind. The sun follows a long course in the day, and the sky is immense beyond all comparison. The great billowing clouds that sail upon it are shadows that move upon the grain like water, dividing light. Farther down, in the land of the crows and the blackfeet, the plain is yellow. Sweet clover takes hold of the hills and bends upon itself to cover and seal the soil. There the Kiowas paused on their way. They had come to the place where they must change their lives. The sun is at home in the plains. Precisely there does it have the certain character of a god. When the Kiowas came to the land of the crows, they could see the dark leaves of the hills at dawn across the Bighorn River, the profusion of light on the grain shelves, the oldest deity ranging after the solstices. Not yet would they veer southward to the cauldron of the land that lay below. They must wean their blood from the northern winter and hold the mountains a while longer in their view. They bore Taime in procession to the east. So he is talking about this ancestral journey of his people, right, where they travel from Montana, this is where they came from, and towards the sort of the plains of Oklahoma, and talking about their progression out of the mountains and onto the plains, and the way that the characteristics of the plains change the farther south they go. So I'm just going to stick a little explanatory comment in there. That way, when we want to come back and reference this part, we'll be able to find it. So he's talking here about the journey of his ancestors, and how the land changed as they traveled south. Okay. A dark mist lay over the Black Hills, and the land was like iron. At the top of a ridge, I caught sight of Devil's Tower, upthrust against the gray sky, as if in the birth of time, the core of the earth had broken through its crust, and the motion of the world was begun. There are things in nature that engender an awful quiet in the heart of man. Devil's Tower is one of them. 2 centuries ago, because they could not do otherwise, the Kiowas made a legend at the base of the rock. My grandmother said, 8 children were there at play, 7 sisters and their brothers. Suddenly the boy was struck dumb. He trembled and began to run about upon his hands and feet. His fingers became claws, and his body was covered with fur. So all of a sudden, one of the kids can't talk, and he starts running around and gets fur on him. This is a legend, obviously, not a literal story. Directly there was a bear where the boy had been. The sisters were terrified. They ran, and the bear after them. They came up to the stump of a great tree, and the tree spoke to them. It bade them climb upon it, and as they did so, it began to rise into the air. The bear came to kill them, but they were just beyond its reach. It reared against the tree and scored the bark all around with its claws. The 7 sisters were born into the sky, and they became the stars of the Big Dipper. So again, thinking about this connection between place and literature and sort of this heritage of his people, right? We see like a place like Devil's Tower, which if you're not, I'm going to real quickly pull up a picture of this so that you can see it. You can do some Googling as well. So you can visit Devil's Tower even still today. It is a real place. Let's see if my computer will let me show you a picture. Do some Google images here. So slow. All right, so this is Devil's Tower, and so you can see this idea of the legend, right? It's clawed, like the bear would have clawed up it. Just looks like a giant tree trunk, but it's huge, and it's rock. Okay, so back to the reading. Let's see. So from that moment, and so long as the legend lives, the Kiowas have kinsmen in the night sky. Whatever they were in the mountains, they could be no more. However tenuous their well-being, however much they had suffered and would suffer again, they had found a way out of the wilderness. My grandmother had a reverence for the sun, a holy regard that now is all but gone out of mankind. There was a wariness in her and an ancient awe. She was a Christian in her later years, but she had come a long way about, and she never forgot her birthright. As a child, she had been to the sun dances. She had taken part in those annual rites, and by them she had learned the restoration of her people in the presence of Tai Mei. She was about 7 when the last Kiowa Sundance was held in 1887 on the Washita River above Rainy Mountain Creek. The buffalo were gone. In order to consummate the ancient sacrifice, to impale the head of a buffalo bull upon the medicine tree, a delegation of old men journeyed into Texas, there to beg and barter for an animal from the Goodnight herd. She was 10 when the Kiowas came together for the last time as a living Sundance culture. They could find no buffalo. They had to hang an old hide from the sacred tree. Before the dance could begin, a company of soldiers rode out from Fort Sill under orders to disperse the tribe. This is sad, right? This sort of recounting of them trying to continue on their practices, but like the buffalo are gone because like the U.S. government deliberately got rid of the buffalo to try and break down native tribes. So they can't continue that practice because they don't have the buffalo to do it. And then while they're trying to do their dance, then the troops come out to disperse that. So it's kind of sad to picture that happening. Forbidden without cause, the essential act of their faith, having seen the wild herds slaughtered and left to rot upon the ground, the Kiowas backed away forever from the medicine tree. That was July 20, 1890, at the great bend of the Washita. My grandmother was there, without bitterness, and for as long as she lived, she bore a vision of deicide. So deicide would mean like the killing of a god, which the idea here being that if they can no longer practice this sort of worship of their sun god, then like essentially the god has been killed out of their culture. Now that I can have her only in memory, I see my grandmother in the several postures that were peculiar to her, standing at the wood stove on a winter morning and turning meat in a great iron skillet, sitting at the south window, bent above her beadwork, and afterwards, when her vision failed, looking down for a long time into the fold of her hands, going out upon a cane, very slowly as she did when the weight of age came upon her, praying. I remember her most often at prayer. She made long, rambling prayers out of suffering and hope, having seen many things. I was never sure that I had the right to hear. So exclusive were they of all mere custom and company. The last time I saw her, she prayed standing by the side of her bed at night, naked to the waist, the light of a kerosene lamp moving upon her dark skin. Her long black hair, always drawn and braided in the day, lay upon her shoulders and against her breasts like a shawl. I do not speak Kiowa, and I never understood her prayers, but there was something inherently sad in the sound, some merest hesitation upon the syllables of sorrow. She began in a high and descending pitch, exhausting her breath to silence, then again and again, and always the same intensity of effort, of something that is and is not like urgency in the human voice. Transported so in the dancing light among the shadows of her room, she seemed beyond the reach of time. But that was illusion. I think I knew then that I should not see her again. Houses are like sentinels in the plain, old keepers of the weather watch. There, in a very little while, wood takes on the appearance of great age. All colors wear soon away in the wind and the rain, and then the wood is burned gray, and the grain appears, and the nails turn red with rust. So he's talking about how rough and sort of unforgiving this environment of the plain is, right? They can build a house, but they very quickly, the paint wears away and the wood wears down and all of that. So kind of describing this process of weathering. The window panes are black and opaque. You imagine there is nothing within, and indeed there are many ghosts, bones given up to the land. They stand here and there against the sky, and you approach them for a longer time than you expect. They belong in the distance. It is their domain. Once, there was a lot of sound in my grandmother's house, a lot of coming and going, feasting and talk. The summers there were full of excitement and reunion. The Kiowas are a summer people. They abide the cold and keep to themselves, but when the season turns and the land becomes warm and vital, they cannot hold still. An old love of going returns upon them. The aged visitors who came to my grandmother's house when I was a child were made of lean and leather, and they bore themselves upright. They wore great black hats and bright ample shirts that shook in the wind. They rubbed fat upon their hair and wound their braids with strips of colored cloth. Some of them painted their faces and carried the scars of old and cherished enmities. So it's like talking about like scars of like basically old battles or old enmities would be like dislikes. So sort of old rivalries, basically people they would have fought with in the past. They were an old council of warlords, come to remind and be reminded of who they were. Their wives and daughters served them well. The women might indulge themselves. Gossip was at once the mark and compensation of their servitude. So it said that, the warriors get together and then the women get to talk and they get to gossip. That's kind of what they do, and that's their reward, is getting to do that, because that must have been enjoyable. They made loud and elaborate talk among themselves, full of jest and gesture, fright and false alarm. They went abroad in fringed and flowered shawls, bright beadwork, and German silver. They were at home in the kitchen. They prepared meals that were banquets. There were frequent prayer meetings and great nocturnal feasts. When I was a child, I played with my cousins outside where the lamplight fell upon the ground, and the singing of the old people rose up around us and carried away into the darkness. There were a lot of good things to eat, a lot of laughter and surprise. And afterwards, when the quiet returned, I lay down with my grandmother and could hear the frogs away by the river and feel the motion of the air. Now there is a funeral silence in the rooms. So it's like he's describing all of this feeling of life in his childhood, and everything is vibrant, and people are there, and people are having celebrations and talking, and now a funeral silence. So kind of this feeling of loss of life, right, in the room. So like the people have gone away. Not that there is necessarily a funeral right now, but just that that world and that life has passed. The endless wake of some final word. So let's comment this here. So, oh, come on. Why won't it let me comment? No, not all of that. This shouldn't be so hard. Okay, well, maybe I'm not going to comment. My computer is feeling grumpy. Funeral silence. Let me have a comment. There, okay. That is because all of the people and the life have left this place. Okay. So it feels like it is dead. Okay, so now there is a funeral silence in the rooms, the endless wake of some final word. The walls have closed in upon my grandmother's house, and when I returned to it in the morning, I saw for the first time in my life how small it was. It was late at night, and there was a white moon, nearly full. I sat for a long time on the stone steps by the kitchen door. From there I could see out across the land. I could see the long row of trees by the creek, the low light upon the rolling plains, and the dark stars of the Big Dipper. Once I looked at the moon and caught sight of a strange thing. A cricket had perched upon the handrail, only a few inches away from me. My line of vision was such that the creature filled the moon like a fossil. It had gone there, I thought, to live and die, for there, of all places, was its small definition made whole and eternal. A warm wind rose up and purled like the longing within me. The next morning I awoke at dawn and went out on the dirt road to Rainy Mountain. It was already hot, and the grasshoppers began to fill the air. Still, it was early in the morning, and the birds sang out of the shadows. The long yellow grass on the mountain shone in the bright light, and a scissortail hied above the land. There, where it ought to be, at the end of a long and legendary way, was my grandmother's grave. Here and there on the dark stones were ancestral names. Looking back once, I saw the mountain and came away. Okay, so that is the end of that. We will, of course, be discussing more in class. So there we go. See you guys in class.